Chapter 9 is entitled Developing Intercultural Relationships. We're going to start by talking about relationships in general. And in the text, we have this idea that relationships are how we define who we are. With this statement, the only way we know ourselves is through our relationships with others. Well, it seems to me that that's a Western perspective. I think from a Eastern perspective, in what we find in Buddhism or Hinduism, for example, is that you find your true self within, and you seek enlightenment, which is actually freeing yourself from the outside world, including relationships. But that's actually one of the things that we're going to be looking at a little bit in this chapter, differing perspectives in the East on relationships. Main topic, however, is going to be how to build successful intercultural relationships, and we're going to be talking about the importance in that process of knowing about the other culture, knowing about the groups that the other person may belong to, the importance of reducing uncertainty in our knowledge of that other person and his or her culture, which in turn reduces anxiety, and the importance of empathy. We're going to start by looking at different types of interpersonal relationships. So there are a lot of different kinds, and many of them are make things difficult for us. We all have a variety of relationships, and sometimes those relationships are great, sometimes they're not. But the problems that we have within our own culture are magnified when we encounter people from other cultures. One of the things that's interesting is that the relationships that one might have in one's own culture, one is very comfortable with, knowledgeable about, and aware of, but they might be quite different in other cultures. For example, one of the things that's pointed out in the text is the relationship between a professor and students, how different that might be in the United States from other cultures, for example. Relationships also are not static. They change over time. Just as a little anecdote about that, I used to be chair of the Department of Foreign Languages when it was separate from the School of World Studies, and it was interesting the change in my relationship with my colleagues when I became chair. For the American colleagues, there wasn't all that much of a change, but for colleagues from Latin America, of which there were a number at the time teaching Spanish and Portuguese, the relationship changed quite a bit, and I think that's because of the recognition of a hierarchy and the recognition that our relative positions in that hierarchy had changed, and so it was interesting to observe that kind of change in our relationship. We have a variety of relationships typically, and we're going to talk about those briefly. The first is strangers, and how we approach strangers is an important topic in this chapter because we're talking about encountering people that we don't know, and those people can be labeled strangers. And typically what happens in that situation is we don't know much about that person. We may know something about or assume something about that person's background, may or may not know the nationality, the cultural heritage, and we may make up for a lack of knowledge by reverting to stereotypes. And we also feel a certain degree of uncertainty in that relationship when we don't know much about that person, what that person's values are, what that person finds as acceptable behavior or as important. leads to anxiety, then uncertainty, and can lead to, obviously, communication difficulties. The context in which the encounter takes place may be a factor that's important in terms of the dynamics of that conversation. And what we talk about when we have conversations with others, particularly if you are assuming that that is a person from a different culture, varies quite a bit in terms of acceptable topics. Topics to be avoided in a number of cultures include politics and religion, as well as talking about how much you earn or asking about somebody how much you earn. But the topic might be even something like members of one's family. In the United States, it would be fine, for example, to encounter a colleague at a party, for example, from your department or from your company. Say, well, how's your wife? Well, in the United States, that would be considered quite polite. In Middle Eastern countries, that would not be an acceptable topic, an acceptable topic of conversation, not be a question that you should ask. In terms of safe topics across cultures, some of the things that are really useful, it seems to me, in facilitating dialogue across cultures, in my experience, talking about food, talking about music, using humor. Humor is something that often works. Sometimes it doesn't come across because of cultural or linguistic barriers. Here's a short example.
So the Dalai Lama walks into a pizza shop.
Cosa shop, correct?
Pizza shop.
Pizza?
Pizza shop, yes.
Yeah, pizza shop. And says, "Can you make me one with everything?"
What's that? That's what. Oh, yes.
Do you know what I mean? Can you make me one with everything?
Theoretically possible.
Oh, I knew that wouldn't work.
That was the Dalai Lama in a conversation with an Australian journalist, and the Australian journalist was trying to break the ice there at the beginning of the interview, and obviously was running up against some cultural misunderstanding there. I don't know if the Dalai Lama eats pizza or knows what pizza is, and certainly didn't get the joke that that the Dalai Lama wanted to have one with everything, namely pointing to the this Buddhist idea of losing oneself in nature. But humor can be something that works. One of the things to be aware of is, in terms of attitudes towards strangers, is that itself can differ from culture to culture. So in collectivistic cultures that have strong in-groups and distinguish clearly and definitively who's in and who's out, you have this sense sometimes that strangers are not really anybody you need to pay much attention to. Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, the Japanese and the Asians in general tend to be very polite, but that's if they know you. If you are in a public transportation situation context in Japan, in the subway, for example, you won't see any of that politeness, the famous Japanese politeness, because you're with people that you don't know, and so those rules don't really apply. In terms of approaching strangers, the United States tends to be a culture that's very different in that respect from a lot of cultures, even other Western cultures. If you compare, for example, the United States with Germany or France, in the sense that that Americans are, by and large, this varies with regionally as well as individually, but Americans, by and large, are pretty willing to enter into conversations with strangers. I would say more so than most Western European countries, which are also individualistic cultures. So if we look at kind of the scales moving from the least intimate to the most intimate, we start with strangers, then we have acquaintances, and then we have friends. And there are different terms in different languages for friend, what the word friend means and what it connotes and what it denotes and what it connotes, in the sense of how close that relationship is and how long it takes to move from being an acquaintance to being a friend and what that friendship means. In the United States, we tend to have a large number of friends, of people that we consider friends, and I'm talking about Facebook friends, it's a whole different topic, but we tend to compartmentalize friendships. And what I mean by that is that we might do one activity with one friend, we might go out and play tennis with one friend, for example, and with another friend or another group of friends, we might go out drinking. So we might have different activities that we do with different friends. And so the meaning of what friendship is can vary considerably. The other thing about friendship in the United States, I think that's different from a lot of cultures, is that we tend to make friends fairly easily, and friends come and go. That is to say that we change when we change locations, move to another city, to go to school or to get a job. Often we lose track of friends, and we make new friends, and that's considered kind of a normal process in the United States. Well, that's not the same everywhere. So in Asia, for example, friendships generally are seen quite differently. They're more permanent, long-lasting, and one keeps in touch with friends. It may have something to do as well with the size of the country that could enter into it as well. And it's also the sense that friends are people that you do everything with, that you share your life with, basically, and you don't tend to compartmentalize the way that Americans tend to do. So as we're moving down the scale towards more intimate, obviously we have romantic partners and friends sometimes become. And here we obviously have very big differences from culture to culture in terms of things like dating, courtship, what love means, how you find somebody that you're going to marry. Those are things we're going to be talking about in this chapter. In the United States, for example, dating is not necessarily something that's going to lead to marriage, and it's something that's seen as rather informal and casual. Not the case in all cultures. Obviously, in the United States, we choose our own marriage partners. That's also obviously not universal. To what extent do families play a role in who the marriage partner is going to be? Well, that's the case in a number of cultures, and we're going to be talking about that as well. And then on the scale of relationships, we have family, which may or may not be an intimate relationship, but at any rate, it's not a voluntary relationship as opposed to the other relationships that we've been talking about. And here too, there's lots of variations across culture. We've talked about that already in this class, the difference between nuclear and extended families, and to what extent also families are important in your life. That varies. So our families, is your family a crucial part of your social identity? Yes, maybe, but not necessarily for Americans. It may be something, you may have a very close relationship with your family, but that's not true of all Americans. And in that sense, that differs as well across cultures. Who makes the decisions in the family? That's something we're going to be talking about as well in terms of arranged marriages. And it's certainly accepted in a lot of other cultures that the family is going to be an important factor in deciding who I marry. I'm not just going to make that decision on my own. In fact, the family may be the one who arranges the marriage. It's something we're going to be talking about. In some cultures as well, it's the parents who decide what the student is going to study at a university and what career that student is going to have. So one of the topics covered quite extensively in this chapter in the textbook is deals with uncertainty and anxiety management, and there are a couple of things that are covered there. I'm just going to go through these briefly because they're covered, I think, quite well in the textbook. We talked about uncertainty and anxiety that result from meeting somebody that we don't know much about, a stranger, because the encounter is unpredictable because of that lack of knowledge. And this is something that I think is a universal human reaction, that we find we're nervous about meeting new people in general, but that is increased when we don't know much about that person that we're meeting, and particularly if language issues come into play, that obviously raises the anxiety as well. And one of the things that's discussed in the textbook is this uncertainty reduction theory by Berger and Calabrese. And the idea is that the more you interact with a stranger, verbally, non-verbally, the more that reduces uncertainty. Obviously, you gain knowledge about that person through that verbal exchange. And the more you're able to predict how that person is going to behave, and the more that increases your comfort level in that conversation. And so there are a number of axioms in this theory, and I've kind of simplified those a little bit here in this presentation. These are the same that are given in the textbook, just a little bit different language. I'm just going to summarize here the bottom line from my perspective of what this uncertainty reduction theory is trying to do. It's trying to say about how to reduce anxiety and improve potential that an encounter is going to be positive. It seems to me that what in essence the theory is putting forward is that you have a high level of uncertainty and anxiety when a conversation starts, and in order to reduce that uncertainty and reduce that anxiety, what you should do is talk. And the more you talk and the more you use nonverbal encouragement, and that nonverbal encouragement certainly varies from culture to culture, certainly include things like nodding and saying, oh yes, very interesting, things like that. The more you put that person at ease, the more you reduce uncertainty and anxiety. So talking is important. Using nonverbal signals is important. And I think this is just a common sense thing, that's how you don't just stand there and not say anything, and that's not going to improve the situation. You talk through it. So this is one theory about how to improve intercultural encounters. This is another anxiety uncertainty management theory, AUM. This focuses on managing anxiety, and there are a couple of things that are interesting, I think, here in this theory. One is the importance of what's called mindfulness. And what's meant by mindfulness is being aware of the fact that the person that you're talking to has different values, has a different set of behaviors that he or she has grown up with. And what that means is that when talking to that person, you need to be aware of those of that difference and negotiate meaning. That is to say, not use your normal way of speaking, for example, with someone who's not a native speaker of English. This is something that you often see happening with tourists. Tourists are not famous for being good at communicating with natives when they visit other countries, and one of the problems is that they're not mindful of differences in communication style, even if the other person knows some English, they're not aware of the fact that they're speaking slang, the tourist is speaking slang, and that might not be universally understood by non-native speakers of American English. That's what's meant by being mindful, being aware of the situation, and negotiating meaning. That is to say, finding other ways to express what it is you have to say, being aware of the language register. That is to say, we have different ways of speaking depending on the context. So in a class, for example, when you're talking in a class at college, you're going to talk in a different register than when you're talking with friends in a bar. So you have to be aware of the language register that you're using. That's part of what being mindful is about. And one other aspect of this theory is, and this too is common sense, communication effectiveness. Well, how do you reach that? Well, you reach it by reducing uncertainty and anxiety, and that's going to be a prerequisite, reducing that level, increasing the comfort level. That's going to be a prerequisite for a conversation to be successful. And one of the things that gets in the way of effective communication is when we're very ethnocentric. Because when that is the case, and when we assume that we're superior in our culture to that of the culture of the person that we're talking to, what happens there is that we're not mindful. We don't think we have to negotiate or adjust in any way our thinking, our speaking, our values, our behavior, because they're all the best there is. So why would we want to adjust anything? And what comes of that, obviously, is that the person who thinks that way has really no interest in an effective give and take conversation. It's all give on the part of the person who's highly ethnocentric. And one other thing that's discussed in this first part of the chapter is something called socio-communicative orientation, which is a communication style that, according to the researcher who propagated this theory, that this style is something that can be effective in intercultural communication, and it calls for two different things: assertiveness and responsiveness. It's a little bit controversial in the sense that assertiveness is something really that is more associated with Western culture, and also to a certain extent more associated with men, and responsiveness may be more associated with Eastern culture. But I think it also has to do with people's individual personality. Shy people are going to have a difficult time being assertive, for example. And the theory here is that for conversations to be successful, we have to do a lot of asking questions, of seeking information. That's what's meant here by being assertive. Well, that works fine, I think, and is normal behavior in American culture. I don't think that it's necessarily the most appropriate way to go about building relationships with people in Asian cultures, for example. And being assertive in Asian cultures is not something that's often seen as a positive. So I think I would say that this is something that to be aware of the cultural differences in using. The final thing in this first part of the chapter, is the importance of empathy and similarity when we're talking about intercultural relationships. And I think empathy is quite clear that's going to be important. And this is something also that where ethnocentrism gets in the way. If we don't feel that there's any value in that other culture, we're not going to feel any empathy. We're not going to try to build kind of a third culture. What's meant by that is kind of a common approach to a worldview. We have different worldviews. When we come together with somebody from a different culture, we have to be open to how they see the world, and we have to kind of mutually come to an agreement of creation, kind of a neutral zone of understanding in order to be able to communicate. I think it's clear that in terms of similarity, this is a natural human tendency to seek out the people and feel comfortable with the people that we're similar to. There's a wonderful, very short scene here that I'm going to show you from a movie called Not Without My Daughter. And the context here is that this family consists of an American woman from Michigan who marries an Iranian. This is at the time, shortly after the Iranian Revolution. Marries an Iranian, and they go back to Iran. And the plan was to just stay for 2 weeks, but the father, the husband, decides he wants to stay in Iran. He insists that his wife and daughter, they have a young daughter, stay there with him. And the American woman knows nothing about Persian culture, knows nothing, doesn't know Arabic, doesn't know anything about Islam. And her husband convinces her to take a introduction to the Quran class. And so this scene takes place in one of those classes.
The Hadiths or reports are the collected sayings of the Prophet with additional commentaries by devout and learned men. In our readings from the Quran, we'll pause to consider the Hadith when appropriate. The Hadith will show us the sunnah or practice of the Prophet and Imam.
You're American.
God has not left the earth since the death of Adam without there being on it an Imam guiding the people to God.
We lived there on the corner of Chicago. But I lived in Michigan. Where in Michigan? Near Lansing. Where near Lansing? Oh, it's a little place. You wouldn't know it, Owasso. I lived there for 5 years. I went to grammar school there. I lived on the corner of Livet and Olean.
My husband's a doctor. He had his own practice there.
My husband's a doctor, too. I can't believe this.
And now I work for an English language magazine for Islamic women.
Have you become Muslim?
Mm-hmm. Did you convert? Well, I wanted to, I guess. My husband was happy I did. It made things a lot better. I gotta go. No, really.
Obviously, in this scene, we have a woman who finds another American in a very unlikely situation, and you can see the joy there on both of their parts of finding somebody who's exactly like them in terms of their cultural background. And this is something that if you've experienced meeting someone from Richmond, for example. I've had this experience. I met somebody a number of years ago, a colleague from VCU, walking down a street in Paris. In fact, it was the Champs-Élysées. And suddenly meeting somebody out of the blue from VCU, and it's a joyful experience, and it's something where you immediately have a lot of things in common. You have a lot of things to talk about. It's a totally different situation than when you encounter a stranger. So in order to build bridges with somebody that we're not similar with, we don't have similarity in cultural background with, we need to find other common elements that we can talk about, and that kind of build a bridge between the two of us. And so, one of the things is to seek out topics of common interest. One of the things that I've done over the years at VCUs, I've taken groups of students abroad to France, to Austria, to Germany for summer programs. And one of the things I always try to do when I organize those programs, mostly language programs, I try to find international schools, because when you go to an international summer school, for example, for learning French or for learning German or Spanish, if the group is truly international and not just all Americans or 95% Americans, then ideally, if you know enough of the language, of the target language, you're going to have a common interest with people from different countries in learning that language. So if you're learning German, for example, you might strike up friendships with people from France or from Brazil who are also learning German, and this is a wonderful way to build a relationship with somebody from a different culture. So we'll end this first part of the chapter with this, and move on in the next part of the chapter to talk about building relationships with people from different cultures that lead to marriage.